The Only Road, Chapter 12. Padre Kevin handed out water bottles and encouraged everyone getting on the train with El Gordo to use the bathroom, and by that he meant the river, before boarding. When the mama with two children asked what the train ride would be like, Padre glanced at the two youngsters before answering, "There are no toilets." A mixture of worry and adrenaline coursed through Jaime. He understood what Padre hadn't said, that he would have said what he would have said if the children hadn't been present. The train ride was not going to be fun. Nerves made Jaime need to pee twice in the time he and Angela stood outside the church in the middle of the night waiting for El Gordo. Not only had he never been on a train before, but he'd never had his life in the hands of a stranger either. Pancho, who had driven them across the Guatemala-Mexico border, had been selling his wares in their village for years before Jaime was born. As far as Jaime was concerned, the old man was like a trustworthy distant relative, but Jaime definitely didn't trust El Gordo. For one thing, how would the gangs who patrol the trains or La Migra know who had paid for protection? Would El Gordo hang cardboard signs from their necks that read, "Don't beat this guy up, he paid"? Jaime shifted from one foot to another and wiped his sweaty hands on his jeans. Anything could happen. A dozen people, mostly men, but also a few women and two children, waited with Jaime and Angela on the dirt street outside the church for El Gordo, where earlier that day Jaime and his friends had played with a semi-deflated ball. The mama clung tight to her children. The water bottles Padre Kevin had handed out seemed to be their only possession, except the little girl also held a scrap of pink cloth that might have come from a blanket. The man in the bandana, who'd been the first one brave enough to go up to El Gordo, paced back and forth. The two brothers crouched with their knees to their chests, trying to get a bit of sleep. At least half of them looked as scared and nervous as Jaime felt. The others seemed more lost and empty, as if they had nothing left to lose in this world. If Jaime ignored the murky brown water, the shreds of plastic bags tangled in the undergrowth, the piles of garbage, the area surrounding Padre Kevin's sanctuary would be pretty. He would miss it. Chapa, ven aquí un momento. The grumpy woman in charge of the food motioned to Jaime to come over to her by the outdoor kitchen. Jaime looked from Angela to the empty street. He was wondering whether to use the river one more time, but supposed he could go to the woman quickly. Any engine that came down the road would be heard immediately. He trotted over to her, keeping his eyes on the street and on Angela. "See?" The grumpy woman pointed at a weather-worn box nestled next to a bag of dried beans. "A missionary donated 500 lead pencils. We'll never go through them in a million years. I saw you drawing the map of the shelters. You got talent. Would you like to take some pencils with you?" "Sure." The pencils weren't good quality. Jaime could tell by the way they felt that the wood would chip when sharpened, the lead would be prone to breaking, and the eraser would smudge the page with a dark streak instead of wiping the markings clean. Still, they were free, and the pencils he had brought with him were wearing down. It wouldn't hurt to take a couple, and besides, it was the nicest thing he'd seen the grumpy woman do or say. "Thanks." He gave her a quick kiss and then ran back to the crowd as he heard a car coming down the road. It was a van, not a car. Of course, they wouldn't all fit into El Gordo's Mercedes, now that Jaime thought El Gordo would let them not that Jaime thought El Gordo would let them near his fancy car. The windowless van reminded him of the one that woman on the bus had been thrown into by La Migra officers, except this one was black, with dents along the sides as if it had been rammed into several times. Could this all have been a trap? Had they paid El Gordo to send them back home? Jaime wanted to believe that Padre Kevin wouldn't allow that, but on the other hand, he had seen how the Padre disliked the smuggler and yet still felt compelled to work with him. Maybe Padre Kevin didn't feel he had a choice, like Jaime. El Gordo's minion got out of the driver's seat this time and opened the rear door. Angela took a deep breath before she seized Jaime's hand. They followed the others into the back of the van. It smelled of dirt and sweat, at least better than El Gordo's offensive cologne. Blessings and prayers came from those staying at the church to brave the train another day, or maybe not at all, their faces more anxious than envious. Que Dios los bendiga. God bless you. Safe travels. Don't give up. And of course, Padre Kevin's own untraditional words. Jesus loves you. It's everyone else you have to convince. Jaime hugged Angela's hand to his chest as the van doors shut and another chapter of their journey ended. A narrow bench had been fitted to either side of the van. The people were crammed so tight, heads and knees were the only things capable of rocking and bumping into each other as the van pulled away. No one spoke, including the driver up front. For the first few minutes, Jaime tried to draw a mental map of where they were going, left, right, but he soon lost track. Not that it mattered, not that he knew where they were going or that he would need to get back. He lost all sense of time. It might have been a few minutes or a few hours. Lights came through the windshield, but the large man sitting next to Jaime blocked the view. At some point, the driver turned off a paved road, and the van began to bounce as it hit craters and rocks. Jaime gripped the underside of his seat to hold himself steady. Angela banged against the side of the van with a yelp. The woman with 2 children cut her hand on a bit of metal sticking out on one side but ignored it to calm her crying kids. The driver slammed on his brakes and one of the men on the opposite bench popped out of the wedged bunch. Nearly everyone on that side fell off their seats into a mosh pit on the floor or on top of the people in front of them. Shh! El Gordo's minion uttered his first sound, sharp and full of urgency. As he ducked in his seat, Jaime bit his lip to keep from crying out. His left foot was trapped and twisted at an odd angle between 2 people on the floor. The mama clamped her bleeding hand over her daughter's mouth and glared at her son to stop crying. As if someone had pushed the mute button on a television, the whole black van fell quiet in an instant. They remained in the tangle of sprawled bodies for several minutes, not daring to move lest they make some noise. Just when Jaime was sure his ankle couldn't bear the pain of being smashed any longer, the back of the van opened slowly without its usual metal clamor. The dim glow from a distant light post illuminated a pock-marked face with eyes set so deep they couldn't be seen. The guy's arms, black with tattoos, held open the back door to keep it from squeaking. If you value your life, you'll come quickly, quietly, and keep out of sight, he said in a low voice. The passengers untangled themselves and tumbled out of the van. Jaime and Angela crouched in the vehicle's shadow, Jaime's sore ankle aching from the weight. The guy couldn't have been much older than Angela, but the scars on his face made him look like he'd been beaten up a few times. In the dim light, Jaime noticed the tattoo covering his arm was lightly wound vines with thorny roses. A gang tattoo. For sure. The guy held out his tattooed arm low to the ground to signal that everyone should stay put. Jaime took the time to look around. They were in a rail yard with lines of cargo train cars on different tracks, but no passenger cars. Under the far-off lights, workers loaded boxcars with goods. By the way the sacks hung over their shoulders, Jaime guessed some were filled with something soft like cornmeal. Others retained their shape and looked like they held cement. Uniformed men strutted along the train cars and peered into the shadows and underneath the cars while clinging to their automatic weapons. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Jaime picked up other details, or, more specifically, other people. Figures darted from behind one car to another. Stealth shadows flickered over the top of some of the cargo cars. Jaime gulped. The cars were much smaller than he imagined, and the train could go faster than an automobile. Falling from the cars would not be a small bump like the plastic men endured when he and Miguel used to play with trains. New worry filled his head. With every shadow he saw, he wondered if it was Xavi, Joaquin, or even Rafa. Would Joaquin ever see them, or would Jaime ever see them again? He pulled the straps of his backpack tighter around his shoulders. The edge of his sketchbook dug into his spine as if to reassure him it was still there. He rotated his banged ankle. It still felt tender, but not enough to keep him from walking or running if he had to. From the corner of his eye, he caught Angela taking a deep breath. Then she nodded, as if trying to reassure him that everything was fine. He knew her better than that. She was just as scared as he was, but pretended otherwise for his sake. In turn, he pretended he believed that everything was fine. An insect made a soft chirp, and with that, the man pointed to Jaime, Angela, and two others, waved his tattooed arms, and took off close to the ground like a coyote. The chosen four ran after him to the shadow of an abandoned hopper car. From there, their tattooed guide motioned for the second four to scurry over. Jaime squeezed Angela's hand and they dashed to the open-topped hopper, keeping close to the ground with their heads scrunched between their shoulders like turtles. Between the train wheels they saw the legs of a uniformed man pass in front of the hopper. His boots shuffled on the ground as if he were bored and looking forward to the end of his shift. Any second he would check behind and underneath the train car and see them all. Angela linked her elbow through Jaime's and kept him tight to her side. If Miguel had been there, he would have thought of some way to distract the guard because Miguel always knew what to do, how to solve problems. The sound of a match being lit hit their ears, followed by the unmistakable smell of a cigarette. The armed man seemed to forget he hadn't surveyed the shadows in the hopper behind him as he should have. Jaime couldn't help but wonder if Miguel was somehow responsible for the distraction. Just thinking of his cousin made him feel braver. Querido Miguel, he prayed like he had on the bus, please help us stay safe. Their leader wasted no time and had them sprinted across an open stretch to the next shadow-concealing car. With Jaime still linked to his cousin, his run was awkward, like they were newborn calves. Jaime kept his eyes on the ground and repeated inside his head, if I can't see them, they can't see me. If I can't see them, they can't see me. Miguel, the scientist, would have teased Jaime for his superstitious belief. Another warming thought. Men shouted and a gun fired. Jaime and Angela sprinted with all their might, their steps falling in sync. It wasn't until they were once again crouched in the shadows of a train car, shaking like a bowl of gelatina, that Jaime realized the gunshot had been fired somewhere else in the train yard. Adentro. Their guide ordered them inside a boxcar attached to many other cargo cars. The opening was only about half a meter wide. A couple of men had to turn sideways to get in. Angela pushed Jaime forward to go before her. The separation from his cousin almost made him cry out for her. Adrenaline from the gunshot still made his heart beat faster than ever. What if they took her away, didn't let her get in on the train? He looked around the train car. In the darkness, he couldn't see anything. He didn't know what kind of train ride he expected, but it hadn't been this. He choked down another cry. Jaime crawled on his hands and knees until he felt another person in the corner of the metal enclosure. With his backpack against the metal wall, he hugged his knees as he stared at the opening. A figure that looked more like shadow came next. That couldn't be Angela, unless the shadow had already devoured her. Where was she? A high-pitched whine escaped his body. It had happened. What he feared more than dying. He was all alone and would never see his cousin again. "Jaime!" came a whisper. "Aquí!" he replied. A second later the monstrous shadow crashed into him. He grabbed the hand, bringing it to his face. A faint smell of mangoes and dog came from it. "Is that you?" "Claro," said the voice he'd recognized anywhere. He'd recognize anywhere. He expected her to tease him for freaking out and not being able to be alone for 15 seconds, but she wrapped him in her arms and kissed the top of his head. Outside, the streetlights had been scarce. Inside, the car was almost pitch black except for the opening, which let in minimal light. People kept entering more than the others who had been in the van with them, sometimes seconds apart, other times at several-minute intervals. No one said anything other than the occasional hushed "aye" when stepped on. A couple of people began to snore. As tired as he was, Jaime kept his eyes on the opening. If one of the armed men poked his gun through, there'd be no hope for anyone. With an eerie metallic shriek, the door thundered closed. The clanged sound of a bar sliding across metal jerked the sleepers awake. Panic and adrenaline rose in Jaime. Some people screamed. He clung tighter to Angela. They were locked in a pitch-black train car with no way of getting out. Prisoners in their escape from freedom.